The Cartographer's Mark. A novel. Chapter 1. The Wrong Map. The border stones were wrong. Seren had known it for the last 6 miles, had felt it the way she felt all geographical errors as a low, persistent wrongness behind her sternum, the specific discomfort of a body that had been trained to read land the way other people read text. The stones were set at the correct intervals. They were the correct type of granite, correctly weathered, correctly positioned along what any standard survey would confirm was the legitimate boundary between the Ashenmoor territory and the Veldrath claimed lands. They were wrong anyway. She crouched beside the third marker from the eastern ridge, pressed her palm flat against its face, and let her senses do the thing that 9 years of cartographic training and whatever else she was, whatever the part of her that could feel boundary lines in the dark, through stone, through 6 inches of frozen mud, had made her able to do. The territorial energy here didn't match the stone. It was older than the stone. It ran 23 degrees northeast of where the marker said it ran, which meant that the entire eastern border of the Veldrath claim had been deliberately misplotted, and whoever had done it had known exactly what they were doing. "You're going to freeze your hand off," Pell said from behind her. "Give me another 30 seconds. "You said that 30 seconds ago." "Then give me 30 more." She heard him exhale, the particular exhale of a man who had been her survey assistant for 4 years, and had therefore developed a specialized relationship with patients that he would not, she knew, describe as patience so much as resigned acceptance of the fact that she was always right about this kind of thing and it was never worth arguing about. The territorial line ran northeast. She traced it with her palm along the stone, felt it diverge further from the marker's face, estimated the degree of deviation. 23 degrees was not a natural settling error. Stone markers shifted over time, frost heaved, tilted. 23 degrees was a choice. Pell. She stood, pulled her glove back on, and turned to look at him. He was a compact man, dark-haired, wearing the standard Survey Corps issue coat that had been designed by someone who had never actually surveyed anything in winter, which made it technically adequate and practically miserable. He had his notebook open and his pencil ready, which she appreciated. "The border's been relocated," she said. He looked at the stone, then at her. "Relocated by how much?" "3/4 of a mile at this marker. The deviation compounds southeast. By the time you reach the Halvarn crossing, you're looking at 2 miles of territory that officially belongs to Veldrath and actually belongs to whoever set these markers." She pulled out her own notebook. "Take down the bearing. 23 degrees northeast of marker face, running toward the eastern ridge at approximately the second split peak formation. The one with the dead larch at the base." He wrote. She watched him write and thought about what 3/4 of a mile of Ashenmoor border territory meant in terms of what was on it, in it, or under it. She thought about the mining surveys she'd read before this assignment. The ones the Ashenmoor Territorial Office had given her to review, casually, as background context. The ones that mapped significant iron deposits directly along the disputed border. "Pell," she said, "do you remember the Halvarn mineral reports? The ones from..." He stopped. She watched him arrive at the same destination she had just reached, by a different road and slightly more slowly. His expression did the thing it did when he processed something unpleasant. "Oh," he said. "Yes. So the border shift moves the iron deposits from contested territory into clear Veldrath claim." She looked at the marker. Which is interesting, given that Veldrath's Alpha King has been petitioning the Territorial Council for exclusive mining rights for the last 2 years. Pell looked at the stone. Then at the ridge. Then at her. "How long ago was this done?" She crouched again, examined the base of the marker where it met the frozen ground. The disturbed soil had compressed and refrozen multiple times, at least 3 seasons of frost cycles since installation. 3 years, minimum. Possibly 4. That's before the petition. Yes, that's what makes it interesting. She stood, made her final notations, and looked at the ridgeline. The second split peak formation was approximately 4 miles northeast, which meant 4 miles of walking in weather that had been declining for the last hour and showed no signs of reconsidering. She could see the leading edge of a cloud bank moving in from the north that had the specific gray-white texture of serious snowfall, the kind that the Survey Corps instructor had described, with clinical understatement, as conditions unfavorable to field work. "We should head back," Pell said. "We should document the next 2 markers first." Seren. "I'm aware of the weather." She was. She was also aware that the next 2 markers would give her enough data points to file a complete boundary challenge with the Territorial Council, and that if she turned back now she would have enough for a preliminary report but not enough for the kind of unambiguous documentation that couldn't be quietly buried by a territorial administrator who had reasons to want the boundary challenge to fail. She had seen boundary challenges buried before. She had been the one, twice, who had documented the burial, the missing reports, the reassigned surveyors, the convenient administrative delays. She knew what thoroughness cost and what its absence cost more. 2 more markers, she said, then we head back. Pell's exhale this time had a different quality. Not resigned patience, something closer to the specific concern of a man who was calculating the weather window against her determination and arriving at a number he didn't like. But he fell into step beside her, notebook in hand, because he had been her assistant for 4 years and had therefore also developed a specialized relationship with following her into questionable situations that he would describe, she suspected, in a deposition someday. The snow started before they reached the first marker. It was not bad snow to start. It had the quality of early snow, fine, almost dry, the kind that accumulated slowly and gave you reasonable visibility and made everything look clean and deliberate. Seren documented the 4th marker, 18 degrees northeast, consistent with the deviation pattern, base disturbed approximately the same time frame, then the 5th, 21 degrees, the deviation moderating slightly toward the ridge, which was consistent with the geological model she was building of where the original territorial line actually ran, and by the time she finished notating the 5th marker the early snow had stopped being early snow. It had become the other kind. "We need to stop," Pell said. He was not wrong. The visibility had dropped to approximately 40 feet and was declining. The fine dry snow had turned into the heavier, wetter variety that collected on horizontal surfaces and reduced them, and the wind had developed opinions. "The track back is east-northeast. We have compass and the ridge line for reference." "The ridge line is no longer visible." She looked east. He was correct. "We have compass." Seren. His voice had changed quality again, a third variation she recognized less often, which was the one that meant he was genuinely concerned rather than professionally concerned or assistant concerned. "My boot is soaked through. I caught it in the stream crossing 2 hours ago and I didn't say anything because we were almost to the markers, but I can feel my toes less than I should be able to." She turned and looked at him properly. His face had the gray-tinged quality of cold that was doing real work. She performed the rapid assessment, time since boot failure, current temperature, projected drop, his mass and the insulating factors of his coat, rate of frostbite onset in those conditions. "How much less?" She said. Enough. She made the decision in the time it took to exhale. We find shelter. The track back is 5 miles in deteriorating visibility with a compromised extremity. She had already turned, was already reading the terrain through the snow the way she read it in all conditions, as a language of slope and aspect and drainage and what lived where. There's a structure 2 miles northeast. I noted it on the approach survey, old stone, possibly a waykeeper's post. 2 miles is manageable. You noted it, Pell said on the approach survey, which you did while we were moving, in your head. I have the bearing. A pause. Of course you do. She had the bearing. She had, in fact, the complete approach survey in her head, not because she had exceptional memory in any general sense, but because her brain processed geographical space the way other brains processed language, automatically encoding spatial relationships, distances, elevations, and the locations of any feature that might constitute shelter, water, or hazard. The Survey Corps had called it exceptional spatial cognition in her assessment documentation. Her mother had called it strange. The Territorial Council's lead examiner had called it the most accurate internal map he had encountered in 40 years of testing cartographers. Seren called it useful, because useful was what it was. She walked northeast into the snow. Pell followed. The wind found opinions about their direction and shared them continuously. The structure was where she had known it would be. It was old, older than the border stones, older probably than the current territorial arrangements, built from the same granite as the ridge and therefore nearly invisible until you were close enough to see the right angles that nature didn't make. A waykeeper's post, as she'd estimated. 3 walls standing, the 4th partially collapsed, a roof that was missing most of its material on the west side but intact on the east. A fireplace in the surviving corner with an ash bed that was cold but present. Someone had used this recently. Within the season, she could tell from the ash, from the compacted quality of the dirt floor near the hearth, from a folded piece of oilcloth she found on a stone shelf that was clean and unworn. She didn't let herself think about that yet. "Get your boot off," she said. Pell sat on the cleanest section of floor and began working at his laces with fingers that were also less functional than they should have been. She went to work on the fireplace. There was a small stack of dried wood beside the east wall, not a large supply, but enough. Whoever used this place had left it provisioned. The fire caught quickly because she knew how to make fires catch. Pell's foot, when the boot came off, was cold and pale and the toes were moving but sluggishly. She knelt, took his foot in both hands, and did the thing she was not supposed to do in professional Survey Corps contexts, which was use the ability that she had listed on exactly 0 assessment forms and mentioned to exactly no supervisor in 9 years of employment. She had tried, once, early in her career, to describe what it felt like. The closest she had gotten was like knowing where the current is before you put your hand in the water. She could feel biological territory the way she felt geographical territory, as a landscape with its own topology, its own fault lines, its own areas of health and stress. And she could, if she was careful, if the cost was acceptable, do something about the stress areas. She warmed Pell's foot from the inside. Not dramatically, not the way the stories described healing gifts, with light and heat and visible effect. Quietly, incrementally, the way frost came out of a wall when a fire had been burning long enough. She felt the sensation she always felt when she did it, a pulling, a slow drain, like lending someone a portion of your own warmth. It took 7 minutes. When she released his foot, he flexed his toes and looked at her with the expression she had learned to expect from people who received this, a mixture of gratitude and the specific unsettled quality of something happening that they couldn't fully categorize. "Thank you," he said. "Don't mention it," she said, which was not social nicety but instruction. He knew that. He had known it for 4 years. She sat back against the wall beside the fireplace and felt the tiredness that always followed, not exhaustion, just a specific depletion, like a lamp that had given light and now burned a little lower. She would recover. She always recovered. It just took time and heat and something to eat, none of which were currently in ideal supply. "The weather isn't breaking tonight," Pell said. He was looking at the gaps in the roof through which the snow was working its way in small, determined quantities. "We're here until morning at least." "Yes." "Whose is this place, do you think?" She looked at the oilcloth on the shelf. At the firewood stacked with a neatness that was habitual rather than occasional. At the smooth-worn quality of the stone where someone sat regularly. Someone who comes here often and comes alone. She paused. "And who will probably come back." The fire cracked. Outside, the storm said what it had to say. She opened her notebook and, by firelight, began writing up her marker documentation in clean form, because the documentation was the reason for all of this, and the reason didn't stop mattering just because the weather had turned hostile. She wrote carefully, precisely, with the specific attention she gave to everything she put on paper, the kind of attention that understood records as arguments and arguments as the only weapons that consistently outlasted the people who made them. She was on the third marker notation when the door opened. He was larger than the door suggested it would allow, and yet he came through it without ducking, which told her something about the economy of a body that had learned to fit itself precisely into the spaces available to it. He stopped when he saw the fire. Then when he saw her. The knife was at his belt, hand going to it automatically, not drawing, just confirming it was there. She had time, in the 3 seconds before he processed the situation, to assess. Tall, dark-haired, mid-30s, built on a scale that had less to do with size than with a quality of physical density that she had encountered before in people who had spent years in terrain that required sustained physical capability. He had a long coat, travel-worn, and snow on his shoulders and in his hair that he hadn't stopped to clear, which meant he'd been moving fast and in weather worse than what was falling here. He had a cut above his left eye that was fresh enough to still be bleeding slightly. He was not aware of it, or had decided it was not a current priority. She looked at him. He looked at her. His hand stayed near the knife but didn't close around it. "This is my shelter," he said. His voice was quiet and completely flat, the voice of someone who had stripped affect out of their communication as standard operating procedure rather than as a response to the immediate situation. "We needed shelter. We'll leave at first light." "We," he said. Then he saw Pell, who had reorganized himself against the far wall and was watching this with the expression of a man who was very tired and very cold and had decided that the person in this situation most capable of managing a large threatening alpha was sitting across the fire from him. He was right about that, for reasons he didn't fully know. "Your assistant," the man said, not a question. "Survey colleague." She looked at his eye. "You're bleeding." His hand came up and touched the cut with the automatic gesture of someone confirming information they had already registered and deprioritized. "I'm aware. I can address it." "I'm fine." "That's not what I said." She kept her voice exactly as flat as his. "I said I can address it. Whether you want me to is a separate question." He looked at her for a long moment. She let him look. She had learned, in 9 years of walking into territorial disputes and boundary contestations and the specific variety of dangerous situation that arose when land and power intersected, that the most effective thing she could do in a standoff was nothing. Not performance, not aggression, not appeasement. Just the patient reality of someone who was not going to be intimidated into making herself smaller than she was. He crossed to the far side of the fire, took off his coat, and sat down. Not near her, at a distance that was tactical rather than social, with his back to the solid wall and sight lines to both the door and the gap in the roof that was the only other possible entry point. He moved the way he'd come through the door, with the economy of someone who had long ago stopped wasting motion. "What are you surveying?" he said. "The eastern border markers." Something shifted in his expression. Carefully, very carefully controlled, but she had been reading faces in difficult terrain for 9 years and she caught it, a sharpening, a recalibration, the expression of someone who has just received information that is significant, and is deciding how significant to let it appear. "Which markers?" he said. "The Ashenmoor Veldrath boundary stones. Specifically the eastern section, from the Halvarn crossing northeast toward the ridge." She looked at him steadily. "They've been moved." "You're certain," he said. "I'm a cartographer. Certainty about this is what I do." She paused. "You're not surprised?" He looked at the fire. "What's your name?" he said. "Seren Ashby, Survey Corps, Territorial Division." She waited. "Yours?" Another pause. This one had a different quality, not reluctance, but the particular consideration of someone deciding which version of the truth to offer. "Corvus Vael." The name meant nothing to her immediately. Then it meant something. Then it meant considerably more than something, and she sat with that for a moment, keeping her face as level as she kept it when she was reading a landscape that had just revealed something she had not expected. Corvus Vael. The name in the Territorial Council's records as the current Alpha King of Veldrath. The man who had been petitioning for exclusive mining rights to the Halvarn deposits for 2 years. The man whose territorial border stone she had just spent 6 hours documenting as fraudulent. "I see," she said. "Do you?" he said. "The border stones were moved before your petition," she said. "Which means either you moved them and then constructed the petition to formalize what you'd already taken, or someone moved them without your knowledge and you filed a petition based on a border you believed was accurate." She looked at him. "Those are 2 very different situations." He was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a full category for, not anger, not calculation, something more complex. The expression of someone who is being described accurately and is taking the time to determine what that means. "You work fast," he said. "I've had 6 miles to think about it." Outside, the storm increased its argument. The fire held. In the corner, Pell had gone quiet in the way he went quiet when he was trying to be invisible, which she appreciated. He was good at reading when she needed the space to work. "The third option," Corvus Vael said, "is that someone moved the stones and then used me to legitimize the result, and I have been, in the specific language of the Territorial Council's fraud protocols, an unwitting instrument." She looked at him. "That's a specific phrase to know." "I read the protocols before I filed the petition. I wanted to understand the legal framework." "And?" And I filed based on the survey maps I was given by my territorial administrator 3 years ago. Maps I had no reason to question. A pause. Maps that were provided by the Survey Corps office in Halvarn. The fire said something. The storm said something louder. The Survey Corps office in Halvarn, she said, is administered by Deputy Director Kane Morath. Yes. Who has been on the Territorial Council's Boundary Commission for 11 years. Yes. And who would have both the access and the authority to commission a fraudulent boundary survey and introduce it into the official record. Yes, that's my understanding. She sat with this. She let the fire be loud for a moment and the storm be loud and the implications settle into the specific arrangement they needed to settle into before she responded to them. You came to this shelter tonight. Moving fast, in bad weather, with a fresh cut above your eye. She paused. You weren't caught in the storm. No. Someone was following you. 3 council enforcers. I lost them at the ridge crossing. They won't find this shelter in current conditions. A pause. They'll find it in the morning. She looked at her notebook. At the documentation that was currently the only field evidence in existence of what Morath had done. At the man across the fire from her who was, by the evidence available, either the perpetrator of a territorial fraud or the most convenient scapegoat for one. She thought about the border stones. About the 18, 21, 23-degree deviations. About the specific knowledge required to execute a boundary falsification at that level of technical precision. Whoever had moved those stones was a cartographer. Not a good one, she had found the error, but a trained one. Deputy Director Morath, she said slowly, was a field cartographer before he moved into administration. Yes, he was. The fire burned. Outside, the world was entirely white. All right, Seren said. Tell me everything. Chapter 2. What the territory knows. He talked for 2 hours. Not continuously, he was not a continuous talker. He had the quality of someone for whom words were instruments rather than ambient material, selected for precision rather than produced for comfort. He talked in the specific, measured way of someone who had been thinking through a problem for a long time alone and was now, for the first time, saying the thoughts out loud to someone capable of receiving them usefully. She listened the way she listened to land, without interrupting the information flow to categorize it, letting the full picture accumulate before she began to draw conclusions. The story was this. 3 years ago, Corvus Vael had commissioned a boundary survey of his territories as part of a standard administrative review. The survey had been conducted by the Halvarn Survey Corps Office, standard procedure. The Veldrath Territorial Office didn't maintain its own survey capability. The results had come back confirming that the eastern boundary ran as the markers showed. That the Halvarn mineral deposits fell within clear Veldrath territorial claim. That the eastern section of the Ashenmoor-Veldrath boundary was stable and uncontested. He had filed the mining petition based on those results. 18 months later, an Ashenmoor territorial official, a mid-level administrator named Halvarn, now dead of what the official record called a hunting accident, had filed a boundary challenge with the Territorial Council, alleging that the eastern markers had been moved and that the Halvarn deposits were in fact within Ashenmoor's legitimate claim. The challenge had been referred to the Boundary Commission. The Boundary Commission was chaired by Deputy Director Morath. The challenge had been reviewed and dismissed within 60 days as lacking sufficient field documentation. Harren had died 4 months after the dismissal. The official record said hunting accident. Corvus Vael's voice, when he described this, was flat and absolutely even and told her everything she needed to know about how he had read that death. After Harren, she said. After Harren, I started looking at the survey maps more carefully. He looked at his hands. I'm not a cartographer. I can read a map, but I don't have the technical capability to identify what you identified today in 6 miles of fieldwork. What I could see was that the maps I'd been given didn't agree with maps from 15 years ago. Small differences. The kind that could be natural drift or could be deliberate adjustment. Did you commission an independent survey? I tried. His jaw was tight. The first surveyor I commissioned retracted his engagement 2 weeks in and returned his advance fee. The second agreed to take the work and never delivered results. The third. He stopped. What happened to the third? She's currently facing a professional conduct review with the Survey Corps Licensing Board. The review was filed by Deputy Director Morath's office. His voice was precise and entirely controlled. She has been suspended pending outcome. Seren thought about this. She thought about the licensing board and the Survey Corps administrative structure and the specific pathways by which a complaint could be escalated into a suspension. She thought about 9 years of being very careful and very invisible and very thorough, and about why she had been careful and invisible and thorough, and about what the alternative looked like. Her name, Seren said. Dava Strand. He looked at her. Do you know her? By reputation. Dava Strand was 15 years her senior, one of the most respected field cartographers in the Eastern Territories, a woman whose documentation standards were considered the benchmark for contested boundary work. She's excellent. I know. A pause. The conduct review is fabricated. I've read the filing. It alleges falsification of survey results on a previous assignment, a commission from 8 years ago. The paper trail has been constructed very carefully. But not carefully enough. He looked at her. You can tell that from a description? I can tell that because if the paper trail were airtight, the review would be finished by now and she'd be delicensed, not suspended pending outcome. She looked at the fire. Someone is keeping her suspended rather than resolved. Which means the fabricated evidence has enough gaps that they don't want it examined too closely, but enough credibility that they can use it to keep her out of the field indefinitely. The fire said something. He was quiet for a moment, in the way she was learning to read as the quiet of someone processing. What is your professional relationship with Morath? She said. None currently. Previously. He paused. The Veldrath Territorial Office contracted with his Survey Corps division for standard administrative surveys over a period of approximately 8 years. Standard relationship. I had no reason to believe he was anything other than what he appeared to be. Which was competent, thorough, politically connected. He looked at the door. I reviewed the contract history after Harren died. The Survey Corps fees for the Halvarn boundary survey were 40% above the standard rate for equivalent work. The overcharge was processed through a discretionary budget line that I had delegated to my territorial administrator at the time. At the time, she said. He resigned 6 months after Harren died. A pause. Voluntarily. With a generous settlement, negotiated by a legal firm that I later found had also represented Morith's office in 3 separate administrative matters. Seren looked at her notebook. She looked at what she had written and what she was adding in the margins, the web of connection that was becoming visible as he talked. She was mapping it the way she mapped terrain, finding the underlying structure beneath the surface features, the places where the logic ran and the places where it didn't. "You've known it was Morith for how long?" she said. "I've suspected it for 8 months. I've been certain for 3. His voice didn't change. "I've had no way to prove it that he can't reach and eliminate. Until someone documented the border stones independently." "Until someone documented the border stones independently," he agreed. She looked at him across the fire. He was watching her with the dark, precise quality of attention she had noted at the beginning, the attention of someone who assessed situations rather than reacting to them. It was a quality she recognized because she had cultivated the same quality in herself, for the same reasons. "Why were you running from council enforcers tonight?" she said. A pause. This one was different from the others, not considering, but arriving at a decision. "Because 3 days ago I found evidence that the boundary falsification is not the primary crime. It's a mechanism for a larger one. The iron deposits in the Halvarn claim are significant, but they're not the point." He reached into his coat and produced a document, folded, sealed with a wax mark she didn't recognize. "The Halvarn territorial zone sits on top of something that isn't on any public map. The iron surveys are cover." She looked at the document. She did not reach for it. "What's under Halvarn?" she said. "A site. Old. Pre-council old. The kind of site that, under the territorial treaty's heritage provisions, cannot be claimed, sold, mined, or developed by any individual or territorial authority." He set the document on the stone floor between them. "The kind of site that the Iron Council itself is legally required to protect. And Morith knows about it." "Morith has been systematically acquiring territorial authority over every piece of land within a 3-mile radius of the site for 11 years. His voice was flat and entirely certain. "The boundary fraud is the final piece. Once Veldrath's claim is formalized and the mining petition is approved, the site falls under a territorial authority he controls." She picked up the document. Broke the seal. "Read it." It was a survey. An old one. The paper had the particular amber quality of age, the ink slightly oxidized, the notation style of a generation before hers. But the cartographic elements were unmistakable. The site coordinates, the depth indicators, the geological notation for a formation she recognized from the advanced heritage studies she'd done in her 2nd year of training. "A ward site," she said. "Yes." She looked up at him. "These don't exist anymore. The last confirmed ward site was sealed 300 years ago. This one wasn't sealed. It was hidden. There's a difference." His voice, for the first time, had something in it that wasn't flatness. Something that was contained but present, the way a current was contained but present under still water. A ward site of this size, under the right territorial authority, with the right extraction capability. "Could be weaponized," she said. "Yes." She sat with the document in her hands and the fire burning in the storm outside, and she thought about what she was holding and what it meant and what the specific weight of this is the reason people have been dying felt like in the hands. The council enforcers tonight, they know you have this. They know I found something. They don't know what yet, or I'd be dead rather than followed. He looked at her steadily. Morath is not sloppy. He's been building this for 11 years without leaving anything the council would act on. He won't move decisively until he's certain. How long until he's certain? When his people find me. A pause, which is why tonight matters. She closed the document. She held it in both hands and looked at the fire and thought about Davis Strand suspended in professional limbo and Heron dead of a hunting accident, and 3 council enforcers somewhere on the ridge losing a trail in the snow, and she thought about her notebook with its careful documentation of 5 border markers that were the first concrete, filed by an independent surveyor, evidence that the fraud was real. All right, here is what I have and what I can do with it. Chapter 3. Running Cold. She had 6 documented markers and the methodology to reconstruct the original borderline from the deviation pattern. This was enough for a formal boundary challenge that couldn't be dismissed without a full independent review, the kind of review that required public record and couldn't be quietly buried in Morath's commission. It was not enough to prove the ward site. It was not enough to demonstrate the systematic nature of the fraud, the connection to Heron's death, or the larger objective. What you have, she said to Corvus Vael, by firelight, with Pell asleep against the wall and the storm outside in its 3rd hour of sustained argument, is a document that proves a ward site exists in the Halvarn zone, but which has no verifiable chain of custody and which Morath will argue is fabricated. She looked at the old survey. Where did you get this? My territorial archive. It was filed under a non-standard reference code in a section of historical surveys that hadn't been indexed since the archive was established. A pause. I found it because I was looking for anything that predated the current boundary survey. I was looking for the original markers. The original markers, not the current ones. The ones from before the fraud. From before the Halvarn boundary was adjusted. He looked at the document. I found this instead. She thought about that. You were looking for cartographic evidence and you found archaeological evidence. Yes. And Morath doesn't know about the archive document. Not yet. The archive is in my territorial seat, in Veldrath proper. His people have access to my administrative files, not my personal archive. He paused. I removed it 3 days ago because I realized they were about to search the administrative files. I've been carrying it since. She looked at him. You've been carrying the one document that makes you worth killing for 3 days. Yes, I'm aware of the risk assessment. I don't think you are, she said, not unkindly, practically because the document alone doesn't prove anything actionable and it puts you in lethal danger, which means the cost-benefit of carrying it is negative. She paused. Unless you have a plan for what to do with it. A silence. I had a plan. The plan involved reaching an independent archivist in the Halvarn free settlement before Morath's people found me. The archivist could authenticate the document's age and provenance, which would give it evidentiary standing. He looked at the door. The plan has encountered complications. The 3 council enforcers. The 3 council enforcers are Morath's people, not the council's. He has enough influence to deploy enforcement assets off record. His jaw was tight. The archivist is a woman named Fen Dallow. She's been operating independently for 30 years. If she authenticates the document, It goes into the neutral heritage record, outside Morit's reach. How far is the Halvarn free settlement from here? 4 days northeast, in good conditions. She thought about Pel's boot and her depletion and 4 days of mountain winter. She thought about council enforcers who would find the Waykeeper's post in the morning. She thought about her documentation of 5 border markers, which was worth exactly nothing if Morit's people got to it before it reached a record that couldn't be suppressed. We need to get Pel to the nearest Survey Corps way station. He's not equipped for 4 days of active evasion. She looked at him. There's a way station at Halvarn Crossing, 2 days south. He can file my preliminary marker documentation from there, get it into the Corps record before anyone can suppress it. That separates you from your colleague. Yes. She said it without inflection, because she had already run the calculation and the calculation came out the same way regardless of how she felt about the variable that had Pel's name on it. He files the preliminary report. The preliminary report creates a public record of the boundary irregularities. Even if everything else fails, that record exists. And you? I go northeast with you. She held his gaze. 4 days. The archivist authenticates the document. We build a complete evidentiary package, the marker documentation, the ward site survey, the authentication, and we take it to the Territorial Council's independent oversight body, not to the Council itself. She paused. The oversight body is chaired by a former Survey Corps director who has been publicly critical of Morit's commission conduct for 6 years. He was looking at her with that quality of attention again, the one she had first read as assessment, and was now beginning to read as something slightly different. Not less careful, but not purely analytical. The expression of someone who is watching a person they have not yet fully categorized doing something that adds a new data point to the categorization. You've been thinking about this for longer than 30 minutes, he said. I've been thinking about Morith for 3 years. She said it simply, because it was simple. Not him specifically. The pattern. Someone in the Survey Corps administrative structure has been systematically redirecting boundary challenges and interfering with independent surveyors for 3 years. I've documented 2 cases directly, been adjacent to 4 others. She looked at the fire. I didn't have a name until tonight. A long silence. 3 years, he said. Yes. And you've been building a case? I've been building documentation. Cases require the kind of evidence I didn't have. Now I have the beginning of it. He looked at her steadily. In the firelight, with the storm outside, she could see the quality of his stillness more clearly, not the stillness of someone waiting, but the stillness of someone who had learned, over time and through specific experience, that stillness was what you had left when everything else had been stripped away, and it had turned out to be more durable than most things. You're going to help me, he said, not a question, an observation that was catching up to a reality he was still integrating. I'm going to build the evidentiary case that takes Morith down. You're going to help me. She paused. If you're willing. Something moved in his face. Brief, controlled, but present. I've been alone in this for 3 years, he said. I know. She held his gaze. So have I. The fire held. Outside, the storm began, very slightly, barely perceptibly, to ease. Chapter 4. What Surveyors Leave Behind. The morning gave them 3 hours of usable weather before the cloud bank returned. Seren used 2 of them to bring Pell current. She told him the essential facts in the specific order they needed to be heard: the border deviation, the fraud, the ward site, the archivist, and what she was going to do about all of it. He listened with his notebook open and his pencil moving, because he had learned that the best way to manage receiving difficult information from her was to document it, which gave his hands something to do while his brain caught up. When she finished, he looked at his notes. "You're sending me to the way station," he said. "You're filing the preliminary marker documentation. And you're going northeast with a man who has council enforcers trying to kill him." "Who has council enforcers trying to kill him so far after this morning? They'll also be trying to kill me, since I'm the person who can testify to the boundary fraud." Pell looked at her. "That's not better. It's accurate." She met his eyes. "The preliminary documentation is the most important thing. It creates a public record before anything can be suppressed. I need you to get it there." He looked at Corvus Vael, who was standing near the door eating the last of his travel rations with the efficiency of someone who ate because it was necessary and not because it was enjoyable. Then back at her. "Who is he?" Pell said. She had been deciding how much to tell Pell since 3 in the morning. The decision was between 2 different kinds of risk: the risk of Pell knowing enough to be targeted, and the risk of Pell not knowing enough to understand why the preliminary filing was life or death critical. "He's the Alpha King of Veldrath and he's been framed." Pell looked at his notes. At the section where he'd written Corvus Vael, Territorial Archive, Ward Site. "Of course he is," he said, in the tone of a man who had been her assistant for 4 years and had therefore stopped being surprised by the scale of things she walked into, while retaining the capacity to be professionally concerned about them. They parted at the Waykeeper's post. She gave Pell her completed marker documentation, the original, in her handwriting, with her Survey Corps registration seal. She kept a copy. He had his own notes as corroboration. 2 days to the way station. File the moment you arrive. Don't stop in Halvarn proper, go straight to the crossing." "I know how to file a report," he said. "I know you do." She looked at him. 4 years of cold mornings and bad weather and the specific trust that developed between people who had worked difficult terrain together. "Be careful." "You be careful, you're the one going northeast." He walked south into the thinning weather. She watched until the trees took him. Then she turned northeast, where Corvus Vael was already walking, coat pulled against the wind, moving with the ground-covering pace of someone who had been moving through difficult terrain for 3 days and had not yet found a reason to slow down. She fell into step beside him and felt the specific sensation she always felt at the beginning of a significant traverse: not excitement, not quite. More like the settling of the body into the understanding that the work had started and the work was what mattered now. "Tell me about Dallow," she said. They walked for 6 hours before the weather made them stop again. In those 6 hours she learned that Dallow was 73, a former territorial archivist who had resigned from council employment 40 years ago in a dispute over the handling of pre-treaty heritage records that had never been formally resolved, that she maintained an independent archive in the Halvarn Free Settlement that was recognized by every non-council body as the most authoritative repository of pre-treaty cartographic and archaeological records in the Eastern Territories, that she had authenticated 3 disputed heritage documents in the last decade, all 3 of which had held up under council legal challenge, and that she had refused, repeatedly and publicly, to submit her archive to council oversight. She also learned, in the specific way that information emerged in long traverses, not from direct questioning but from the texture of conversation, other things. That Corvus Vael had been Alpha King of Veldrath for 9 years, having inherited the title at 26 after his father's death. That his father had also died of what the official record called natural causes. That he had spent the first 3 years of his rule dealing with the administrative and financial consequences of a territorial authority that had been, under his father, significantly mismanaged, not through corruption, he was careful to say, but through the specific variety of mismanagement that came from a good person in a role they were not suited for, trying very hard and succeeding at less than they needed to. That he had, in those 3 years, developed a very precise understanding of the difference between what the record said and what was true. Your father's mismanagement, she said. They were crossing a frozen stream, testing each step, the ice reliable but only barely. Was it used against him? Not directly. He was ahead of her, and he stopped and turned when she said it, and she watched him weigh the question the way she'd been watching him weigh things all morning, with the specific consideration of someone who had learned that accurate language was more important than comfortable language. He was not a strategic person. He trusted the people around him because he was trusting, and several of those people were not trustworthy. A pause. The mismanagement benefited the people who had created it. By the time I understood enough to see what had happened, those people were gone and the money was gone and the damage was done. And you cleaned it up. I've been cleaning it up for 9 years. He turned and kept walking, and she kept step beside him. Which is why the petition mattered. The Halvarn iron deposits would have provided significant revenue for Veldrath's infrastructure recovery. It was not. He paused. It was not a land grab. It was an administration trying to rebuild. She heard what was underneath that. The specific quality of someone describing a situation where their intentions were good and the outcome was fraudulent anyway, and having to hold both of those things at the same time. I know, she said. He looked at her. I read the petition when it was filed. The Survey Corps reviews all boundary-adjacent mining petitions as a standard process. I read it 3 years ago and thought, the infrastructure allocation model was detailed in a way that suggested genuine need, not extraction for profit. She paused. I thought, whoever filed this cares about the territory, not the revenue. He was quiet for a moment. You remembered that, he said. I remember surveys, it's what I do. The ward site, have you been to it? I've been to the area. I didn't know what I was standing on until I read the survey. He was quiet for a moment. It felt wrong. I've been to every part of my territory at least once since I took the title. I wanted to know the land I was responsible for, and the Halvarn zone has always felt wrong. Like the ground had a different quality there. Thicker, somehow. She understood that. She understood it with her palms and her sternum and the part of her that felt territorial lines as a physical fact. A ward site that old would have significant residual energy. The boundary between active and contained would be permeable. You'd feel it as a location that your instincts don't settle in. He looked at her. You know about ward sites? I know about territorial energy systems. It's adjacent to cartographic training. A pause. The way a ward site's energy interacts with surface geography is why they were hidden rather than sealed. Sealing a site requires the right kind of authority, the kind that doesn't exist anymore. Hiding it meant putting enough territorial complexity over it that no one could read through the noise. Can you? Read through the noise. She looked at the ridge ahead, at the geological features that were beginning to suggest they were in the outer influence zone of whatever was underneath the Halvarn ground. I don't know yet, I've never been near one. The honesty of that seemed to land. She felt him recalibrate slightly, not toward less trust, but toward a different kind of it. The kind that came from someone acknowledging what they didn't know rather than constructing confidence they didn't have. The cut above your eye from last night, can I look at it? He touched it. It had closed overnight, but the skin around it was tight and slightly swollen in the way that said cleaning would have been useful 12 hours ago. It's fine. Let me look at it, she said, which was not the same statement as it's fine. He stopped walking. She stepped in front of him, reached up, and examined the cut with the clinical attention of her gift rather than her eyes, feeling the tissue, the swelling. The early-stage inflammation that left unaddressed became the kind of problem that was expensive in the field. She did what she did, carefully and minimally, the small focused work of encouraging the tissue to do what it was going to do anyway but faster. He went still under her hands. Not the stillness of being touched, something more attentive than that. The stillness of someone noticing something and choosing not to comment on it yet. She stepped back. Thank you, he said. His voice was careful in a way it hadn't been before. Keep it clean if we cross water. They kept walking. She felt the slight depletion and ignored it, because ignoring it was what she did with depletions. The ridge was 3 miles out. The weather was holding, marginally, and the light was the flat gray of a winter afternoon that had 3 hours left in it. She thought about Pell walking south. About the preliminary documentation in his pack. About what it meant that two people who had been alone in different parts of the same problem for 3 years were now walking the same direction. She thought about the ward site and what it meant that it existed and what it meant that someone was trying to own it. She thought about Corvus Vael walking beside her, his coat dark against the white slope, moving through the terrain with the patient precision of someone who had been moving through hard things for a long time and had stopped expecting them to get easier and started expecting himself to be sufficient to them. She filed it carefully, in the part of her that was careful about things that mattered. Chapter 5. The Weight of Old Ground. They found shelter in a rock formation similar to the previous nights. The mountain range was generous with those, which was one of the things she had noted in 9 years of surveying it. The eastern Halvarn ridge was riddled with a specific kind of geological chaos that created natural architecture, and she had spent enough time in it to know where to look. This formation had a south-facing aspect and a wind shadow that made it warmer than the temperature suggested, and she built a fire with a competence she always built fires, and they ate from his supplies, and she realized they hadn't eaten since morning and that she had been aware of this in the background and had not mentioned it because there were other things that required attention and food was something she dealt with in the spaces between other things. "You didn't eat today," he said. "I ate this morning." "That's not what I said." She looked at him. He was holding out his remaining travel rations, hard cheese, dried meat, a small roll that had been compressed in his pack but was technically still bread. She took it. "Thank you," she said. He looked at the fire. "You do that. Process the practical requirements as secondary to the task. Eat when you remember. Sleep when you can't not." A pause. "I do it too. It's efficient." It's a habit developed in conditions where the task was urgent enough to justify it, which is different from it being efficient. She looked at him. You're making an observation about how I function. I'm making an observation about how we both function. He met her eyes, which is probably relevant over 4 days of shared terrain. She thought about that. What else did you note? You read the landscape constantly. Not just when you're surveying, always. You were mapping this formation before we entered it. He wasn't asking. And when you checked my cut this morning, you did something that wasn't just medical examination. She held his gaze. Pell doesn't ask about it, she said. Pell knows I watched his face the night before. After you worked on his foot, he knows, and he's decided not to think about it too carefully. She looked at the fire for a moment. What I have isn't a single defined ability. It's more like spatial sensitivity that extends to biology. I can feel where a system is under stress. Geographical systems, biological systems. She paused. I can sometimes address the stress. In small ways. It has a cost. What kind of cost? Depletion. The same kind of territory feels after a hard winter. Everything is still there, but the reserves are lower. She looked at her hands. I recover. It just takes time. He was quiet for a moment, processing this in the manner she was becoming accustomed to, thoroughly, without rushing to a conclusion, giving the information the weight it deserved. In the ward site tradition, he said slowly, there were 2 kinds of keepers. The boundary keepers, who maintained the territorial lines, and the site readers, who could interact with the sites directly. Feel the ward energy, assess its condition, sometimes reinforce the containment. He looked at her. The site readers had the exact ability you're describing. She looked at him. Site readers were rare. He continued. The old records describe them as occurring approximately once in a generation, and only within lineages that had long histories of territorial connection to a specific region. He paused. The Ashby lineage has been in the Eastern Territories for, how long? As far back as I can trace the family record, 400 years, minimum, she said slowly. The ward site in the Halvarn zone, he said, is estimated to be approximately 400 years old. The fire held. Outside, the temperature was dropping in the specific way of mountain knights that had decided to make a point. You think I'm descended from whoever created the ward, she said. I think the reason you can feel borderlines that aren't visible, and read biological systems, and interact with territorial energy, is because you were born to do it. And I think the site in the Halvarn zone is specifically the site your lineage was built to protect. He met her eyes, and I think Morth knows that. She sat with this. She let the fire be loud, and she sat with it. That would mean, she said carefully, that the fraud isn't just about the iron deposits or the ward site in general. It's about controlling access to a site that requires a specific person to interact with it safely. Yes. And the systematic targeting of cartographers who got close to the Halvarn boundary was looking for you. Or for anyone with your ability. Morith has been combing the Survey Corps for 11 years. The surveyors who were redirected or suspended or died, they were all in the Halvarn region. They were all people he was testing. His voice was very controlled. Dava Strand was his closest candidate before you. She has partial ability, enough to read large-scale geological anomalies. Not enough to do what you can do. Seren looked at the survey document that was in her pack with her own documentation. At the pre-treaty notation for a site of extraordinary heritage significance. At the coordinates that she had, since reading them, felt as a kind of gravity in her chest, a pull that she had been interpreting as professional interest and was now reconsidering. You knew about this before tonight before you found the archived document. He didn't answer immediately. I suspected when I found the survey, the suspicion became certainty. He met her eyes. I was going to find you. She looked at him very steadily before you found the enforcers on your trail. Yes. You were going to come to the Survey Corps. I was going to come to you specifically. His voice was level. There's one cartographer in the Eastern Survey Corps Division who has been documenting boundary irregularities in the Halvarn region for 3 years while staying below the threshold of official attention. One cartographer whose field reports consistently describe territorial energy readings that no standard training accounts for. He held her gaze. I was going to find you and tell you what I've just told you. She looked at the fire. She thought about 3 years of being careful and invisible and thorough, of documenting quietly so no one would notice until she had enough to matter. Of finding cases she couldn't fully explain and following the evidence anyway. I've been doing more search for him, my documentation of the Halvarn anomalies, if he has access to Survey Corps internal reports. He has access to everything, the Survey Corps files. His voice was steady and not gentle, because gentling the truth was not what she needed, and he had, apparently, worked that out. He's known you were getting close for 18 months. The reason you haven't been redirected or suspended is that he needs you to get to the site under controlled conditions. He needs me to lead him to the site. He needs you to activate the site. A pause. The ward energy has been degrading for a century. The survey estimates it has 30 to 50 years before full collapse. The collapse of a site this size would be catastrophic for the surrounding territory. But if someone with the site reader ability intervenes before collapse, reinforces the containment, the site becomes stable. And stable, under the right territorial authority, means accessible. He held her gaze. Morath doesn't want to destroy the site, he wants to use it. Use it for what? She said. The ward sites weren't just barriers. They were batteries. The energy they contain, correctly accessed, under the right authority structure, is the single most significant source of territorial power in pre-treaty records. A functioning ward site, activated and tapped rather than contained, could fuel an Alpha's territorial reach across an area 3 times the current council's entire jurisdiction. The fire cracked. Outside, the mountain was absolutely quiet in the way of things that had been listening. He wants to be king, she said. He wants to be the only kind of king that's ever been permanent, the kind with power that doesn't depend on politics. She looked at her hands. At the palms that had warmed Pel's foot and sealed the cut above an eye and read 5 border stones in the snow. At the thing she'd carried for 9 years as a professional asset and a personal secret, and apparently, it turned out, as a target painted on her back that she hadn't known was there. All right, she said. Her voice was entirely steady, because it was going to be, because the steadiness was the thing she was not going to let this take. Then we have more work to do than I thought. Yes, he said. Fen Dallow's authentication matters even more than it did this morning. Yes. And we need to understand what it would mean if I... She stopped. Started again. If the site reader theory is correct, and I'm able to interact with the ward, I need to understand what that interaction does before I do it. I'm not walking into a pre-treaty energy structure without knowing the mechanics. The archive at Dallow's settlement has the original construction records if they still exist. She's spent 40 years acquiring pre-treaty documents the Council tried to bury. Then that's where we go, and we go fast. He nodded. He looked at the fire, and then at her, with the expression she had been cataloging all day, the one that wasn't purely analytical, the one that had something in it that was an assessment. I'm sorry for what you're being drawn into. I've been in it for 3 years, I just didn't know the shape of it. She met his eyes, and I'm not drawn, and I walked in both times. Something shifted in his face. The particular thing she'd been watching shift, incrementally, since the night before. She looked at the fire. Sleep, we move early. She took the first watch. He slept with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned to use sleep when it was available because it wasn't always, and she sat by the fire and read her copies of the survey documentation and thought about lineage and ward sites and the 400-year connection between a family and a piece of ground, and about the specific sensation she'd felt since they crossed into the outer Halvarn zone, the pull in her chest that she had been cataloging as professional interest, and was now cataloging as something considerably older and more foundational than that. Chapter 6. Dallow's Price. The free settlement of Halvarn was not on any official map. This was partly because official maps of the region had been, as Seren now understood in some depth, subject to a degree of editorial management over the past 11 years. But it was also, she suspected, partly because Dallow preferred it that way. The old archivist had the quality, even at a distance, even through reputation, of someone who had spent 40 years being exactly as visible as she chose to be and not 1 degree more. They found the settlement on the morning of the 3rd day, in a valley that the geological maps suggested shouldn't have been there and which was, when you read the terrain with the right attention, obviously there, hidden not by any magic but by the specific topography of a valley with a north-facing entrance that made it invisible from the approach routes and visible only if you knew to look for the drainage pattern of a stream that ran south rather than north, against the slope, which meant it was fed by a spring in the valley floor rather than by runoff, which meant the valley was sheltered and warm and had been inhabited for a very long time. She pointed this out to Corvus as they descended. You read that from the stream direction, he said. From the stream direction and the vegetation pattern and the soil color and 2 bird species that don't usually range this far north unless the local microclimate is warm enough to support their food sources. She paused in the smoke. He looked. There was, very faintly, smoke. You saw the smoke first. I see the other things too. The settlement was 30 structures, stone and timber, arranged around a central hall that had the particular quality of buildings where serious work happened. Not grand, functional, with the specific neatness of people who maintained their tools well because their tools were what they had. Dallow met them at the outer edge of the settlement. She was precisely as Corvus had described her, small, iron-haired, with eyes the color of old amber and the quality of someone who had been wrong about very few things in 40 years and had stopped being patient with people who were. She looked at Corvus. You're late. I was 3 days ahead of schedule. You were 3 days ahead of your schedule. She looked at Seren. And you're the cartographer. Seren Ashby, Seren said. I know who you are. Dallow looked at her with an attention that was not the standard social variety. The attention of someone reading information that was visible to her specifically. I've been expecting someone like you for about 15 years. Took longer than I thought. She turned and walked toward the central hall. Come inside. We have a great deal to discuss and a limited amount of time in which to discuss it, and I am 73 years old and no longer willing to have important conversations in the cold. They followed her. The archive was in a room below the central hall, cut into the bedrock, not a basement but a deliberate construction, the walls lined with sealed stone shelves, the temperature cool and stable. The documents here were organized with the specific, rigorous system of someone who had been organizing them for 40 years and who could locate any item in the collection in under 3 minutes regardless of condition or time of day. Dallow located the original ward site construction records in 4 minutes, which she noted, as she laid them on the examination table, was slightly longer than usual because she'd moved them 2 months ago when she'd received intelligence that suggested someone might be looking for them. What intelligence? Corvus said. Council enforcers asking questions in Halvarn proper about pre-treaty heritage records. She sat at the table with the authority of someone who had been sitting at this table for 4 decades. Morith sent 3 of his people to the town archivist 3 months ago. The town archivist is not an ally of mine, but he is also not a fool, and he sent me word. She looked at them both. I've been preparing for this conversation since then. Preparing how? Seren said. By authenticating the survey document before it arrived. Dallow reached into the stack of materials she'd assembled and produced a bound report. I have access to field samples from the Halvarn zone that predate the current survey record. Soil chemistry, geological markers, territorial energy residue measurements taken over the past 30 years. When you show me the document, I will be able to confirm its provenance in approximately 2 hours, and the confirmation will be backed by the most comprehensive independent dataset on the Halvarn zone in existence. She looked at Seren. But first I need to talk to you alone. Corvus looked at Seren. I'll be here. He went to the outer room. Dallow waited until the sound of his footsteps had settled, then looked at Seren with the amber eyes. You've been feeling the pull for 2 days, the old woman said. Since I crossed into the outer zone. Since before that, probably since you started surveying the border markers. She folded her hands on the table. You've been inside the site's awareness for 3 years. The documentation work you've been doing, you've been circling it like a surveyor who knows there's something in the center but can't quite read the edges. The site has awareness, Seren said, not skeptically, the way she said everything, as a question that required actual information. The ward energy is not inert. It has the quality of any long-contained system, a kind of accumulated intentionally. The people who built it put something of themselves into the construction. Over 400 years, that something has developed what I can only describe as a preference. Dallow looked at her steadily. A preference for the correct kind of interaction. Which is what I am. Which is what you are. A pause. Your grandmother was a cartographer. Seren went still. She was. And her grandmother before that. And before that, back to the original site keeper, the woman who built the ward and embedded her lineage in its architecture as the access key. Dallow produced a document, old and carefully preserved, from the stack. This is the original keeper's record. The Ashby lineage is named. You are, unless there's been a break in the line I don't know about, the direct descendant. Seren looked at the document. At her family name in 400-year-old ink. At the architectural notation beside it, which described an access protocol she didn't recognize but which her palms, she noticed, were beginning to respond to anyway. "What does activation require?" she said. "Physical presence at the site and willing contact." Dallow looked at her very directly. "Not compelled. Not tricked. Willing. The ward architecture specifically excludes coercive access, it was designed that way. Which is why Morath can't simply force you to do it." A pause. "Which is also why everything he's done has been oriented toward creating conditions under which you would willingly go to the site and interact with it, believing you were helping." Seren held the old woman's gaze. "He needs me to believe I'm stabilizing it. He needs you to believe you're preventing collapse." Dallow's voice was precise and not unkind. "Which you would be. The stabilization is real. The ward is genuinely degrading. But the protocol for stabilization and the protocol for activation are the same first 12 steps. The difference is in the 13th. "What's the 13th step?" "It depends on what the site reader intends." Dallow looked at her hands. "If you intend containment, the energy restructures toward containment. If you intend access, if you intend to open rather than close, it restructures toward access." She paused. "And if you intend neither, if you're uncertain, if someone has created the conditions for that uncertainty, the site reads the dominant intention in the space." "Which would be," Seren said slowly, "the intention of whoever was there with me." "Yes." Dallow met her eyes. "If Morath is present when you begin the activation sequence, and if his intention is access, and if yours is genuinely unclear, the site will open." Seren sat with this. She sat with what it meant that she had been navigated toward this point. That the 3 years of documentation work and the boundary challenges and the career she had built in the exact right region, all of it had been, in some significant part, the architecture of someone else's plan using her as the key they needed to turn. "I'm angry," she said, not at Dallow just stating the fact of it, because the fact was there and she was precise about what was true. "Yes, you should be." "Does the Alpha King know all of this?" Dallow looked at her. "He knows the historical elements, the ward site history, the lineage theory, the activation mechanics." She paused. "He doesn't know that Morath's long game has been specifically oriented toward you. He told me he was going to find me before the enforcers found him." "He was." Dallow looked at the document between them. "He came to me 8 months ago when he first identified Morath as the source of the fraud. I told him then what I'm telling you now, that the ward site requires a specific person, and that the specific person was almost certainly the cartographer in the Eastern Survey Corps who had been documenting the Halvarn anomalies." She paused. "I told him the Ashby name, he found the rest." "He came here to recruit me," Seren said. "He came here because his territory is being stolen and the mechanism for stealing it involves someone who didn't know she was being used." Dallow's voice was precise. "Whether that's recruitment or something else depends on what he's done with the information in the 8 months since I gave it to him." She looked at Seren. "What has he done with it?" Seren thought about 2 days on a mountain ridge, moving through hard terrain, having a conversation that was the first honest one she'd had with anyone in 3 years about what she was and what she could do. She thought about the way he had told her what she needed to know rather than what would have been convenient for his purposes. "He told me everything, including the parts that make me a target." Dallow nodded slowly. "Then you'll have to decide what that means." She stood and reached for the bound authentication report. I'll need the document. Shall I call him back in? Yes, call him back. Chapter 7. The Architecture of Betrayal. The authentication took 2 hours, as Dallow had estimated. During those 2 hours, Seren sat at the archive table and read the original keeper's records from beginning to end. All of them. Dallow had 3 centuries of accumulated documentation on the Halvarn site, the construction records, the quarterly assessments conducted by successive generations of site readers, the point at which the assessment stopped, approximately 130 years ago, because the Ashby lineage had dispersed and the last known site reader had either died without a successor in the region or had chosen, for reasons the record didn't explain, to stop coming. 130 years of unattended degradation. It was a miracle the containment had held this long. She read with the attention she gave to everything important and felt, throughout the reading, the pull in her chest strengthened incrementally with each page, as if the records themselves were part of the site's awareness, and reading them was a form of approach. Corvus sat across from her and read the documentation she gave him. He read with the same quality of attention she had observed in him from the beginning, total, methodical, without the performance of urgency even when the subject matter was urgent. She watched him, in the margins of her own reading, and thought about the 8 months in which he had known her name and her lineage, and her position in Morith's plan had said nothing to her directly. She thought about why. The honest answer, which she arrived at before she asked him, was, because a letter from an unknown Alpha King saying you are a hereditary ward keeper and a criminal conspiracy's instrument would have achieved nothing except her professional disappearance. He would have been dismissed as a threat. The information would have been worse than nothing. It would have given her fear without context, and fear without context made people retreat rather than advance. He had waited until the context existed. Until she had found the markers herself, until she had the documentation, until she was already in the situation and needed the information to navigate it rather than simply to be afraid. She didn't know if that was calculation or care. She suspected it was both. I need to ask you something, she said. He looked up. Dallow told you 8 months ago that the target person was the Ashby cartographer in the Eastern Division. She held his gaze. In those 8 months, you made no contact. No. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because if I had contacted you before you were in a position to act on the information, the only effect would have been to put you in Morith's sight earlier than you already were. He paused. And because what you were doing, the documentation work, the case building, was the right thing. Disrupting it would have disrupted the evidence. You were building what we needed, more carefully than I could have built it. Another pause. And because I didn't want you to come into this through a message from a stranger. I wanted you to come into it through the work itself. She looked at him for a moment. That's a very long answer. It's a very exact answer. It is, I know. Dallow finished the authentication and set the bound report on the table between them. The document is genuine. Pre-treaty, approximately 400 years old. Cartographic notation consistent with the construction period of the Halvarn site. She looked at them. The authentication report is filed in 3 external archives, the Northern Heritage Trust, the Independent Scholars Record at Greymount, and the Territorial Archive of the Halvarn Free Settlement. It cannot be suppressed. She paused. But authentication alone doesn't stop Morith. No, Corvus said. But combined with the boundary marker documentation and the ward site identification, it gives us the basis for a heritage protection petition that the Territorial Council is legally required to act on. Once the site is formally identified as a pre-treaty heritage site, Morith's entire scheme collapses. The boundary fraud becomes simultaneously a property crime and a heritage violation, which triggers a mandatory independent inquiry. Who chairs the independent heritage inquiry? Dallow said. The Northern Heritage Trust, which is one of the 3 archives you just filed the authentication in. Yes. Something in her expression was the specific satisfaction of someone who has been building toward a moment for 40 years and is watching it arrive. Morith will know the authentication is filed within hours. His people have watchers at the Heritage Trust submission office. So he'll move, Corvus said. He'll move immediately. Dallow looked at them both. He has 1 card left, and he knows it. If he can get to the site before the heritage petition is formally acknowledged, and if he can trigger the activation before the site falls under heritage protection. He doesn't have a site reader, Seren said. No, he has something else. He has the degradation timeline, which I believe he has had confirmed by a specialist. I cannot identify the site as approximately 8 to 14 months from critical failure. At critical failure, the ward energy doesn't simply dissipate, it inverts. Inverts, Corvus said. The containment becomes catastrophic release. Everything the ward has been holding for 400 years, the territorial energy, the accumulated intention of its builders, releases into the surrounding territory simultaneously. Dallow's voice was precise and entirely without drama. The immediate impact zone is approximately 12 miles. No living thing in that zone survives. The secondary effects on territorial energy systems across the eastern range would destabilize every boundary in the region. The disruption would create, essentially, ungoverned territory, large swaths of land with no viable territorial authority, for years, possibly decades. Seren looked at her hands, and in the chaos of ungoverned territory, a sufficiently resourced and sufficiently organized territorial authority could expand to fill the vacuum. Filling a vacuum is considerably easier than winning an election or a war. So his backup plan, if he can't get the site activated properly, is to let it collapse. If he can make the collapse look like a natural event, yes, an unattended pre-treaty site failing due to neglect, it's not his fault. He's simply the one prepared to manage the aftermath. She looked at Seren. Which is why the question of whether you go to the site matters beyond the evidentiary case. If no one intervenes in the next 8 to 14 months, people die. Regardless of what happens to Morith. Seren looked at the record spread across the table. At 400 years of her family's name in the documentation. At the activation protocol she had been reading for 2 hours and which her hands had been responding to since she first touched the page. I need to know what the 13th step is exactly. Dallow found the page. She pointed to the notation, which was in the original scripted language of the construction records, and translated it. Seren, read it. She read it again. She understood, for the first time since Dallow had explained the distinction between stabilization and activation, exactly what the difference was, and exactly what Morith had been counting on. The 13th step required the site reader to name the territorial authority under whom the site would operate. Not just to contain the energy, to direct it. To give it a governance structure. And if the site reader named no one, if they were genuinely uncertain, if they had been manipulated into uncertainty, the site read the most present territorial authority in the space and named them by default. If Morith was standing at the site when she completed the sequence, his name would be the default. She set the page down. "I need to go to the site," she said. Both Dallow and Corvus looked at her. The heritage petition is the evidentiary case. It takes care of Morith legally. But it doesn't take care of the site. 8 to 14 months, that timeline doesn't accommodate bureaucratic process. The heritage inquiry takes 6 months minimum. She looked at Corvus. "I need to stabilize the ward before the inquiry concludes. Which means I need to go to the site before Morith can react to the authentication filing." "How long before he knows?" Corvus said, looking at Dallow. "The Trust Submission Office has a council informant who reports to Morith weekly. He files his report on Thursdays. Today is Monday. We have 3 days. The site is." Seren looked at the map, calculated, 17 miles from here, 2 days of hard travel, given current conditions. Which leaves us 1 day at the site before the window closes. Corvus met her eyes. "That's enough time." "That's enough time if nothing goes wrong." "Things will go wrong. We plan for what goes wrong." She looked at him. She thought about what Dallow had said. Whether that's recruitment or something else depends on what he's done with the information in the 8 months since. She thought about 2 days on a ridge, honest, moving together. "You don't have to come to the site. The site activation is something I do alone if you're not there. Morith can't use your presence as a governance default." "I'm aware. I'm coming anyway." "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression that had been developing over 3 days of hard terrain and honest conversation, the one she had been cataloging in the careful part of her, and which she had not yet fully decided what to do with. "Because you've been alone in this for 3 years. And regardless of what happens at the site, no one should do the most difficult part alone if there's someone available to be beside them." She held his gaze. She thought about the specific sensation of not being alone in a hostile space, which she at first felt when Pell limped beside her in the mountain cold, and which she was feeling now in a different way that she was going to have to think about more carefully later. "All right? All right?" Dallow looked at them both with the amber eyes and said nothing, which was the kind of nothing that contained something. Chapter 8. Into the Ward. The Halvarn site announced itself to Seren 2 miles before they reached it. Not loudly. Not with drama. With the specific sensation she had been feeling since the outer zone, intensified now to something that was less a pull than a recognition, as if a part of her she hadn't known was dormant was waking up in stages, becoming more present with each half-mile, filling in a shape she hadn't known was empty. "You feel it," Corvus said. He was watching her face the way he'd been watching it since the second day, with the attention of someone cataloging information that mattered. "Yes." She looked at the ground. The vegetation here was different, not absent, but changed, growing in patterns that reflected something beneath the surface, the specific influence of territorial energy on biological systems. The way iron deposits bent compass needles, but subtler and more complex. It's been aware of me since the outer zone. It's been orienting. She paused toward me. Is that what it's supposed to do? According to the construction records, yes. She had spent the previous night reading the records Dallow had provided in full, memorizing the activation protocol with the same spatial encoding she used for terrain. The site architecture includes a recognition function. It identifies the site keeper lineage. She paused. It's been alone for 130 years. Whatever awareness a ward site develops in 400 years, it's been without the thing it was built to be near. Corvus walked quietly for a moment. How does that affect the activation? It makes it more responsive. The records describe a site that has been recently attended as requiring more intention from the site reader. It has its own energy to contribute. A site that hasn't been attended in over a century. She paused. Is hungry or more immediate? Is that dangerous? I don't know. She said it precisely, because precision was what the situation required. I've never done this before. The records describe the mechanics but not the subjective experience. She looked at the ridge ahead, where the site was. She knew it now as a physical certainty, felt the location the way she felt the location of a stream through a hillside. What I know is that I need to be very clear on the 13th step. On what I intend. What do you intend? He said. She had been thinking about this for 2 days. Stabilization. Containment renewed. The site sealed as a heritage site, access restricted to appropriate oversight. She paused. The territorial authority named in the protocol. It needs to be someone, he said. It needs to be someone with standing to hold a heritage site. She looked at him. The protocol doesn't require the authority to be physically present. It requires the site reader to name them with genuine intention. She held his gaze. If I name the Northern Heritage Trust as the governing authority, the site's energy structures toward institutional protection rather than territorial control. That's what the original builders intended, not individual territorial ownership but collective heritage stewardship. He nodded. That's what the protocol supports. Yes, the 13th step is the naming. Everything before it is preparation. Then let's prepare. The site itself was a hollow in the ridge, not a dramatic geological feature but an absence, a shallow bowl of ground where the rock had been carved, very long ago, with the specific tools of people who understood the relationship between geological form and energy flow. The construction was almost invisible to ordinary inspection. To Seren, it was the clearest thing she had ever seen. She could feel the entire architecture of it the moment she stepped into the bowl. The concentric rings of territorial energy, each one at a specific frequency, each one serving a function in the containment system, like the rings of an old tree, each one a year of accumulated intention. She could feel where the energy had thinned, where the degradation had progressed, which sections were load-bearing and which were secondary. She could feel the site's recognition of her landing like a physical sensation behind her sternum, warm and immediate, and very old. She stood in the center of the bowl and breathed and let herself be known by it. I need to tell you something, Corvus said. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the bowl, outside the outer ring, which was the appropriate position for someone who was not the sight reader and which she noticed he had found without being told. Tell me, she said. The 3 council enforcers who were following me, they weren't Morit's people. She went still. They were my people. My territorial enforcers, acting on instructions I gave them 3 weeks ago. The instructions were to follow me at a distance and intercept me if I made contact with anyone from the Survey Corps. He met her eyes across the bowl. Because 3 weeks ago, I received information that suggested the cartographer I was looking for might be working for Morith, not against him. That the documentation of the border markers might be a performance, a way to create false evidence that would be used to challenge my petition and destroy my territorial standing, while the real crime continued under cover of the challenge. Seren looked at him. You thought I was Morith's instrument. I thought it was possible. The evidence was fabricated, I understand that now. Someone fed me false information about Survey Corps activity in the region, and I acted on it. When I saw you at the Waykeeper's post. He paused. I spent the first hour of that night deciding which of two things you were. And by the second hour I had decided. He held her gaze. But I needed to tell you what I'd thought. Before you do this. A pause because you should know everything before you make a decision that matters. She stood in the center of the bowl with the sight's warmth at her back and looked at him across the outer ring. She thought about the fabricated evidence, who could have planted it, who had the access and the motive to make Corvus Vael distrust the one person who could document the fraud. The answer was not complicated. Morith fed it to you, she said. Yes. He knew you were coming for me, he knew the authentication path. She looked at the ground. He tried to put you in position to intercept me before I reached Dallow. Yes, and then the storm complicated his plan, and instead of intercepting you, I ended up in a Waykeeper's post with a fire and a broken door and a choice. She looked at him. You made the right choice. I know, but you deserve to know about the wrong one. She stood in the ward site and felt the truth of him, felt it the way she felt everything important, as a spatial fact, a thing with location and weight and the quality of something that had held its shape under pressure. The honesty of it was real. The 3 days of it had been real. Whatever he had thought in the first hour of a cold night in a storm, the decision he had made and kept making since then was real. Tell your enforcers to stand down. He produced a signaling device from his coat, the wolf territory equivalent, small and specific, and sent the pattern. A long moment. Then an answering pattern from somewhere on the ridge above them. Done. All right? She turned back to the center of the bowl. Stay at the outer ring. Don't cross it until I say. I'll be here. The same quality of commitment as when he'd said I'm not losing you, not dramatic, just certain. The kind of certain that had been decided and was not revising itself. She placed her hands against the central stone, not a marker, just stone, flush with the earth, the same color as everything around it, invisible until you knew what you were looking for, and then the only thing you could see. She began. The activation protocol took 47 minutes. She knew this afterward, she had no sense of time during it. What she had was the sight, all of it, suddenly, simultaneously, the way you suddenly understood the full architecture of a building when you finally found the load-bearing wall. The energy rings were visible to her in the specific way that geological formations were visible to her, as something she read rather than saw, a language she was fluent in without having formally learned it because it had been in her hands since birth and waiting. The degradation was worse than the records had suggested. The outer 3 rings had lost significant coherence, not failed, but thin, the way old fabric went thin before it finally tore. The inner rings were holding, but the stress was visible in the pattern, the way a survey showed stress in fault lines. She worked from the outside in. Not with the small, targeted attention she used for biological systems, This required the full extension of what she was, the thing she had been keeping below the detection threshold for 9 years, finally running at its actual capacity. It was like the difference between speaking quietly in a language you knew and finally speaking it at full volume. It cost. She felt the cost accumulate with each ring, each repair, the depletion that was deeper and more total than anything she had felt before. Not painful, that wasn't the right word. More like the specific sensation of giving something that was genuinely yours to give, something that diminished you in the giving and would take time to regenerate. She gave it anyway, because the ward had been alone for 130 years and the giving was what the sight reader was for. She reached the 13th step. She thought about what she intended. She let the intention be clear and specific and wholly her own. She named the Northern Heritage Trust as the governing authority with the same precision she used for survey notation, exact, unambiguous, not subject to interpretation. She felt the site receive the name. Felt the energy restructure around it, not the explosive reconfiguration she might have imagined, but the slow, thorough settling of a system that had been under strain and was finally being properly supported. Ring by ring, from the center out. The thin outer rings, reinforced from inside, regaining coherence. The stress patterns in the inner structure, released from the load they've been carrying, relaxing toward their natural frequency. It took longer than she'd planned. The depletion reached levels she hadn't anticipated, and she stayed anyway, because the work wasn't finished, and because she was an Ashby and this was what Ashbys did. She was dimly aware, at some point in the later stages, of Corvus crossing the outer ring. She had said, "Don't cross it until I say," and she had not said, but she had not said it because she was past the point of speech. He didn't touch her. He sat at the inner ring's edge, close enough that she could feel his presence the way she felt warm stone, steady and substantial and not going anywhere, and that presence was, she realized in the part of her that was still registering things other than the sight, exactly the right thing to have in the space. Not his governance intention. Just his presence. His specific quality of not leaving. She completed the 13th step. She named the Heritage Trust and she let the site's energy settle around it, and she felt the ward complete its restructuring, and she felt it become, for the first time in 130 years, attended. Then she sat down on the stone floor of the bowl and did not entirely remain conscious. Chapter 9. The Weight of Evidence. She woke to warmth and the smell of pine smoke and Corvus's coat over her shoulders. She was sitting against the inner stone of the bowl, and the site was quiet around her in the specific quality of a system that had resolved, the hum of contained energy instead of the grinding stress of imminent failure. She felt it as a physical relief, like the easing of a tension she had been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing it as tension. "How long?" she said. 3 hours. His voice came from beside her. He was sitting close, not touching, but within arm's reach, the same not quite distance as the boulder cavity on the second night of travel. "You completed the activation and then your body decided it was done." The depletion was significant. She moved carefully, tested her hands, her feet, the various systems. Everything working, depleted but functional, the lamp burning lower but still burning. "I pushed harder than I meant to." The outer rings were worse than the survey estimated. "I could see." He paused. "I could see something while you were working. Not the energy itself, but the effect of it. The air quality changed. The temperature in the bowl was different from outside it." She looked at the stone at the center. It was the same as it had been, flush with the earth, unremarkable, invisible. But it felt different. Settled. Complete. It's stable. I know I could feel that too. She turned to look at him. In the afternoon light, and it was afternoon now, she noted, the sun already descending toward the ridge, his face had the quality it had in the firelight 2 nights ago. Clear. Stripped of the surfaces that existed in ordinary situations. What did you feel? He was quiet for a moment. Like something that had been wrong for a very long time became right. He met her eyes, not for me specifically, the land like the land exhaled. She understood that she understood it in her palms and in the chest. She looked at her hands. The heritage petition we need to file today, before Morith knows the authentication is in. Dallow is filing it. She is standing the petition independently as a heritage archivist. She told us this before we left. The petition is filed the moment she hears from us. He produced the signaling device. I can send the confirmation from here. Send it. He sent the pattern. After a moment, the acknowledgement came, 3 short pulses, then a long, then 3 short again. She recognized the heritage filing confirmation code from the records she'd read, which meant Dallow had chosen a code deliberately aligned with pre-treaty protocol, which meant she was thorough in the way that mattered. It's filed. Then we have time. She looked at the ridge. We need the complete evidentiary package to reach the oversight body. My marker documentation. The authentication. The ward site identification. The timeline evidence connecting Morith to the fraud. She looked at him, and I need to reach Davis Strand. He looked at her. The conduct review against her. Once the oversight body has the boundary fraud evidence, the review collapses. It was filed by Morith's office, and Morith's office is going to be the subject of a mandatory inquiry, but Strand has been suspended for 18 months. She needs to know what's happening. She paused. She also needs to know what she was tested for. The partial ability, Corvus said. She's been in a conduct review for 18 months, wondering what she did wrong, not knowing that she was targeted specifically for what she was. She looked at the bull. That's not a thing you let someone carry alone. He looked at her for a long moment. No, you don't. She leaned against the inner stone and felt the sights quiet and felt her own depletion and felt, beneath both of those, something else. The specific sensation of 3 days of hard terrain and honest conversation, and a man who had sat at the edge of the inner ring and simply stayed there. She had been very careful with that sensation. She had been filing it and not examining it for 3 days, which was a strategy that she acknowledged, in this moment of post-activation honesty, was not a sustainable one. You told me something this morning about the false intelligence Morith gave you. Yes. And you told me it was important to tell me before I did this, so I would know everything. Yes. I want to tell you something with the same logic. He waited. I work alone. I have worked alone for 9 years, deliberately, because working alone is what kept me below the threshold of notice, and because the Survey Corps work is easier with only my own judgment to account for. She looked at her hands. And I have been aware, for the last 3 days, that working beside you has not been harder. It has been. She paused, finding the precise word. Easier in ways I didn't anticipate and am still adjusting to. He was very still. I'm telling you this before we separate to do the evidence work. Because after the evidence work, there will be administrative proceedings and oversight inquiries and the specific variety of bureaucratic process that takes months, and I don't know what my situation looks like at the end of all of that. I'm a Survey Corps cartographer who activated a pre-treaty ward site and bypassed several layers of administrative process while assisting an Exiled. She stopped. I haven't been exiled, he said. The Territorial Council tried. The Alpha Council never recognized it. Veldrath's charter doesn't allow unilateral council action on territorial titles. Morris people have been trying to enforce an exile that was, technically, never legally valid. A pause. One of the things the oversight inquiry will establish is that the exile action was itself part of the fraud, a mechanism to remove the territorial authority most likely to challenge the boundary claim. She looked at him. You're the Alpha King. I've always been the Alpha King. The title didn't go anywhere. A pause, and something in his voice that was different from anything she had heard in 3 days, quieter and more present. What goes where after this depends on a lot of things. She held his gaze. I told Dallow that I thought you had told me everything rather than what was convenient for your purposes. I thought that was true. She paused. I still think that's true. He looked at her for a long moment, in the ward site bowl, with the afternoon light going gold above them. It is, he said. Then I want to continue having that kind of conversation, whatever form it takes, whatever the administrative situation looks like afterward. She met his eyes. I told you I work alone. I'm telling you that I'm revising that position. He was looking at her with the expression she had been cataloging for 3 days, the one that was too large and too specific and that she now recognized as what it was, the expression of someone who had been very careful for a very long time about what they showed and was, in this moment, not being careful. I've been alone in the Veldrath restoration for 9 years. I told you that on the first night. I've been saying it as a fact about the situation. He looked at the bowl, at the quiet stone at its center, and then back at her. I want you to know that it was also a fact about what I was aware of missing. Specifically, not just a partner in the governance work. He held her gaze. Someone I could tell the truth to who would tell it back. She looked at him. We've been doing that. Yes, we have. The site was quiet around them. The afternoon light was going from gold to the flat gray of approaching evening, and the ridge held the last of it in the specific way of peaks that caught light after the valley had already given it up. We need to move soon before the temperature drops. Yes. He stood and offered his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet with a matter-of-fact practicality of someone who had been helping her manage a depleted body for 3 hours, and was continuing to do so without making it a larger gesture than it was. She kept his hand for a moment. After she was standing, he kept it too. Then she released it, and she picked up her pack, and they walked out of the bowl together, through the rings of a ward site that was finally, after 130 years, attended again. Chapter 10. What the map shows now. 3 months later. The Territorial Council's mandatory inquiry had been underway for 11 weeks when Deputy Director Cain Morith was formally arrested on charges that included territorial fraud, heritage site violation, conspiracy to commit illegal territorial expansion, and the misuse of council administrative authority for private gain. The arrest was the 4th consequential event of an inquiry that had moved, for a body accustomed to moving at its own pace, with unusual speed, which observers and the independent press attributed to the quality of the evidentiary documentation and which Seren privately attributed to the fact that the inquiry chair had been waiting for 11 years to have a reason to look hard at Morit's commission. She was in the inquiry room when the charges were read. She was there as a witness, not the first witness nor the last, but the one the inquiry chair had scheduled immediately before the introduction of the ward site documentation, which was the strategic choice she would have made if she were chairing the inquiry. She testified for 2 hours. She did not perform for them, did not modulate her account for effect, did not give them anything other than the precise sequence of events in the precise order they had occurred with the precise level of certainty she had for each element. She had been building this testimony in her notes since the morning of the 5th marker, and it was as thorough as everything she built. When she finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms went quiet when they had received a great deal of information very quickly and were still integrating it. The inquiry chair, the former Survey Corps director she had mentioned to Corvus on the first night, a woman in her 60s with the quality of someone who had built her career on not being wrong and was therefore very careful to only say the things she was certain of, looked at Seren across the chamber and said, "Is there anything you wish to add to the record?" Seren thought about what she wanted to add. She thought about Davis Strand, who had been reinstated with full compensation 3 weeks after the preliminary evidence reached the inquiry, and who had come to find Seren the day of her reinstatement, and sat across from her in a small room and said very little but said it in a way that covered a great deal. She thought about Pell, who had filed the preliminary marker documentation at the waystation at Halvarn Crossing and then filed a personal report with the Survey Corps Internal Investigation Unit that had been, he had told her, with the air of a man who had made a decision and was comfortable with it, something he'd been building for 6 months before any of this happened. She thought about Fen Dallow, whose archive had been formally recognized by the Territorial Council's Heritage Authority 4 weeks ago, in a ceremony the old archivist had attended with the expression of someone who had been right for 40 years and was entirely unmoved by the official acknowledgement of it. She thought about the ward site, which was quiet and maintained and which she had visited twice in the 3 months since activation to assess the ongoing status of the containment. She was, it appeared, a sight reader, the first active one in 130 years, and sight reading required regular attendance, and the Halvarn ward site was 2 days from the Survey Corps Eastern Division office, and this was something she was going to have to account for in her professional schedule going forward. She thought about the Alpha King of Veldrath, whose exile had been formally declared invalid in the inquiry's 3rd week and whose territorial standing had been fully restored in the 5th, and who was currently sitting in the witness gallery with the quality of contained attention she had learned to read over 3 days of mountain travel. No, the record is complete. The inquiry chair nodded. Seren stepped down. Corvus was waiting for her in the corridor outside the chamber, because the hearing was scheduled for the rest of the afternoon, and the rest of the afternoon was going to be administrative testimony from Survey Corps internal investigators, which was accurate and necessary and did not require either of them to be present for it. "How did it go?" he said. "It went correctly, which is all I ask of testimony." He fell into step beside her. They walked out of the council building and into the city's main square, where the afternoon was doing the thing it did in late winter, deciding, incrementally and without commitment, that it might eventually become spring. The inquiry chair wants additional written statements on the ward site activation sequence. Her letter suggested it would be useful for establishing precedent for heritage site management protocol. I received the same letter. What did you tell her? I told her I would provide a complete account of what I observed, which is limited to what a territorial alpha senses in the presence of a functioning ward site. He paused. I told her the witness with the more complete account was the site reader. I'll write the protocol statement. It's cartographic work, essentially documenting the activation sequence. He was quiet for a moment. They had been having this kind of conversation, administrative, practical, the work of rebuilding what had been broken, for 3 months, in letters and in the 2 other meetings the inquiry process had required. The conversations were always accurate and always contained, in the gaps between the practical elements, the thing they had said to each other in the ward site bowl that neither of them had said again because the inquiry process was not the place for it, and they were both people who understood the difference between appropriate time and place and the absence of it. The inquiry process was concluding. There's a position opening in the Veldrath Territorial Cartographic Office. The senior cartographer retired last year. The office has been understaffed since. He looked at her. I've been informed that the position is formally outside my authority to fill. It's a Survey Corps placement, subject to Corps staffing decisions. But you're telling me about it. I'm telling you about it because the territorial office would be responsible for the standard administrative survey work for the Veldrath claim, which includes the eastern boundary zone and the Halvarn region, and because the position would include access to the territorial archive. He paused. And because the site reader for the Halvarn ward is going to need to make regular visits to the site, and the practical question of where that person is based has administrative implications. She looked at him. That's an extremely practical argument. I make practical arguments when the other kind seems like it might be unwelcome. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The other kind would not be unwelcome. He looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging for 3 months, in letters and in 2 formal meetings and in her memory of a hollow and a ridge in the afternoon light. The expression that was too large and too specific, and that was, she knew now, simply what his face did when it wasn't being careful. I have thought about the conversation in the ward site most days for 3 months. I have also thought about it. I thought about what you said. About revising your position on working alone. He held her gaze. And I thought about what I said, about what I had been aware of missing. And I thought about 3 days of mountain terrain and the specific quality of someone who tells the truth and expects truth back. He paused. I thought about it very precisely, the way you think about survey problems, looking for the points of error, the places where the calculation was flawed or the evidence insufficient. And I found 3 months of additional evidence, and the calculation held. He met her eyes. I want the kind of conversation we started in the ward site. The ongoing version of it. Not as an administrative arrangement and not contingent on the survey position, and not at whatever pace the inquiry process determines. He paused. I want it because I've been alone in the difficult parts for 9 years, and the 3 days when I wasn't were the most legible 3 days I've had in a very long time. She looked at him. She thought about the specific legibility he described, the quality of a landscape that had finally been correctly mapped, all the features in their right places, the whole coherent in a way that the pieces had only suggested. She thought about what it meant that a person could be a landscape in that sense. That the territory of a person could be read, and that reading it could feel like finally understanding a map she had been working on for years. The survey position is the eastern boundary zone part of the standard scope. Standard scope includes everything within the Veldrath claim, which includes the eastern boundary zone and the Halvarn region and the heritage site. A pause in the territorial archive contains the complete pre-treaty cartographic records for the region, which would support ongoing site reader work. Another pause: the senior cartographer's residence was in the Eastern District, 4 rooms and a fieldwork studio. That's a very thorough description of a position you had no authority to fill. I prepared. She looked at him for a long moment, in the middle of the city square where the afternoon light was deciding to become something warmer, and she felt the specific sensation she had been feeling in the background for 3 months as a continuous low register of the things she'd been cataloging and not examining, felt it clearly, fully, without the distance of professional necessity. She felt it as what it was. And what it was something she had not felt before, in 9 years of being careful and capable and alone, and she was not going to pretend she didn't know what it was just because acknowledging it required a kind of attention she wasn't practiced at. I'll file a transfer request with the Survey Corps. Something in his face changed, the thing she'd been watching change, incrementally, since the first night, completing itself. And the other kind of argument, he said. You can make it, she said, while I'm filling out the paperwork there's going to be a great deal of it. Something that was not quite the smile she had seen twice and remembered precisely, something larger and less controlled and more genuine even than that, passed across his face. I've been dealing with administrative process for 9 years. I know where to find good coffee. That will help. They stood in the square for a moment longer, in the specific comfortable quality of 2 people who have been honest with each other through difficult terrain and have arrived, finally, at the part that is not difficult but is large and real and requires a different kind of attention than everything that preceded it. Then she pulled out her notebook, because she was a cartographer and she always had her notebook, and the first entry in a new map was the most important entry, the one that established the coordinate system for everything that came after. She wrote the date. She wrote the location. She wrote, in the precise notation of a surveyor who understood that the most important records were the ones made at the beginning, before the full shape of the territory was known. Starting point. Initial survey. Territory, unknown. Approach, with the correct partner. She closed the notebook. The coffee first. The coffee first, he agreed. They walked across the square together, toward the part of the city where the afternoon light was warmest and the work of rebuilding was already underway, and behind them the council building contained the last of Morth's administrative architecture, which would be dismantled, precisely and thoroughly, by people who had waited 11 years for the tools to do it. And below the Halvarn Ridge, 2 days northeast of the city, the ward site held its containment with the quiet certainty of a system that had finally been attended, the energy running clean and stable through stone that was 400 years old, waiting in the way that only very old things could wait, with the patience that understood the difference between time passing and the right time arriving. The right time had arrived. Seren Ashby, cartographer, site reader, Ashby of the Eastern Territories, walked into the spring afternoon and was, for the first time in 9 years, entirely certain of where she was going. End.